All right.
Is Peter going to be here tonight?
Yeah, I just have to, I think he needs a new link. Let me just,
Okay.
I think I gotta send him another link.
Still so much easier in person.
That's true.
Hopefully soon.
All right. Yeah, I just got a text. I just got a message that I assume that this must be Peter saying I need a link sent.
I just sent it
All right. Yeah,
and I just texted him.
Got you. It was in, I think, Noel's email buried in there somewhere. So,
He's coming.
yep, no problem. All right, I think he's in.
Thank you, Arnett. I don't know where it was.
I think it was buried in an email from last week, like Thursday or Friday of last week.
It was.
I'm sure.
We,
I'm just
Peter, we never get enough emails, right? So,
exactly. I'm just not bright enough to find it anymore.
so, all right. Well, let's. I guess let's call this meeting to order, and we'll start with a pledge. Very nice. Pledge allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America,
and
to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice
for all.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well,
Mr.
yes,
Belliver,
thank you. Here.
Mr. Talbot, and
Here.
Mr. And we have a quorum present for the meeting.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands,
You watching
one
playback?
nation, under God, indivisible.
So thank you all for being here. I wanted to, hopefully we'll have a chance to hammer this all out tonight. Jeff, thank you for being here. And Mike, also, thank you
Sure.
for joining us again. Now that we've hopefully all had a chance to take a look at Mike's proposed changes for the ordinance. I know I've had a chance to talk to both Jeff and Mike about it. And so I think there's some good ideas here. See what we can do to hopefully hammer this out and finally get this thing to where we're ready to put it back to the full council. So with that, I know that the main items that we have are the sort of the definitional items that were suggested sort of for O, P, and Q, but also as they may impact N as well in those changes. Also, we have the proposed changes that will affect section H in here, and then which were language proposed by Mike, and then also section 9, which was a more in-depth outline of the failure to pay fine and the appeals procedure. And I think what I'd like to do is maybe start with, so we can maybe get one. Can we start with number 9, the items for number 9, which is the failure to pay fines and appeals, and the language that's in that one? Because I think we could hopefully dispense with that fairly quickly. With that, one of the things that I know that we looked at was this sort of expansion of the procedure. And Jeff, I'll start with, had you took a look at this as well?
Yes.
And I know one of the things that when I talked to Mike about this, you and I had some discussions about it, but Mike, we talked about the question about referring to the under subsection C below in paragraph One, and I think just to remove that language for clarity's sake, so it would just say, upon the expiration of the 10-day period for the uncontested payment of fines, the blight prevention officer shall send notice to the person cited. And that way we're no longer have a reference to C under subsection C below, where the question was where you couldn't see. I don't think we need it. And I think Mike agreed that we can just take that out. So we're not referencing to something we're not exactly sure where we're going.
Works for me.
Okay. And then, so with that, I think that I know, obviously I looked at Mike's discussions. I think it's good. Jeff, did you have any other changes on that? And then I'll also open it up to see, Peter or Don, if you guys had any further changes or suggestions as to section 9.
No,
No, that answers my question.
the only thing, as we talked about, is the new section 9 now obviates section G. So we can just delete, if everyone's on board with that, just delete G and then go with 9.
Right. And that's good. So I raised that with you, Jeff, and also with Mike, and we all agreed. I think that G, the language of G is now incorporated into H, so it didn't make sense to keep it in both places. So we can eliminate that G, and then obviously, so now H becomes effectively the new G.
Well, if there is an H.
I'm sorry. Right. I'm sorry. Yes.
Otherwise I becomes G.
Jeez, come on.
We get it. Everything moves up 1.
Right. Well, yeah, because where H is going to be H is the next paragraph that the paragraph that we're going to have to discuss.
Yep.
Because that's the other. So I think with that, I think we're good with number 9 and the changes that are proposed for paragraph 9 that removes G. And so, as I said, I think that's a quick and easy one to move on from. So with that.
David, could you just clarify something? You
Yes.
said that section C under 9, is that being removed or reworded? What?
I know. So yeah. So paragraph 1 will say, upon the expiration of the 10-day period for the uncontested payment of fines, the words under subsection C below are being removed.
Thank you. That's what I wanted clarification on.
Yep.
Got
So
it.
it'll go from payment of fines, comma, the blight prevention officer shall send notice.
Okay, got it.
No other changes to that paragraph, so we're good with that one. So now let's work our way backwards now, and we're gonna go to H.
7H.
Yes. 7H. Now this is right now anyway, this is language that right now there is a paragraph H in there in the original draft that we had seen. And now Mike had suggested a much larger section H, which now refers to Connecticut General Statute 7-148 F. And so one of the questions I had, and Jeff, you and I had discussed a little bit, and I mentioned this to Mike as well, as I was some concern as to whether there was conformity between this structure and the structure under which we are originally creating the ordinance, which is a different section of the statute. And so I wanted to just follow up with you and see what your thoughts were on this structure and whether it's sort of appropriate this one, or if we need, if there's other language that we need to address in H to address this situation of, and for what it's worth, this is the lean and clean provisions of this of the ordinance, and this is different than a situation where, hey, we're noticing you for you to fix something. This is the provision where you haven't fixed it. We're giving you notice that we're going to come in because you haven't fixed it. We're going to come in and fix it for you. And now we're going to lien you for that prevention, for the your failure to do that, what we've asked you to do. And so this is a slightly different structure in the sense that it's now creating a format by which the town would actually, after notice, enter the property and cure the problem, and then potentially bill the owner of that property back for the town's work and the cost in doing that. And so this structure, as proposed by Mike, creates a committee that would look at that and go forward. And so I wanted to see, but as I said, my conversation with Jeff involved some situations of whether this was in conformity with what the rest of the structure, and also if not, what language could we use in substitute for either keep it the way it is right now under H that we have as drafted that we've previously reviewed and sent to the council, or do we want to substitute different language? So Jeff, did you have
Yeah.
any suggestions on that?
So let's take a step back, okay? If you look at the first paragraph of the draft ordinance, the declaration and purpose, okay?
Yep.
In the middle of the paragraph, we say this ordinance is enacted pursuant to section 148 C7 H15 of the Municipal Powers Act of the State of Connecticut General Statutes, okay? So if you had the statute in front of you and you were looking at 7-148, which is the Municipal Powers Act, and you looked at C7H, you would see public health and safety is the subdivision of that subsection of the statute. And if you looked at 15 says make and enforce regulations for the prevention and remediation of housing blight, including regulations reducing assessments and authorizing designated agents of the municipality to enter property during reasonable hours for the purpose of remediating blighted conditions, provided such regulations define housing blight and require such municipality to give written notice of any violation to the owner and occupant of the property, provide a reasonable opportunity for the owner and occupant to remediate the blighted conditions prior to any enforcement action being taken, and further provided such regulations shall not authorize such municipality to enter any dwelling house or structure on such property, and including regulations establishing a duty to maintain and specifying standards to determine if there is neglect, prescribe civil penalties, not less than 10, no more than $100. So that's the section that this ordinance is promulgated under or proposed to be adopted under. And if you go back to the very first time that we talked about this, which was June, that was the overview I gave in terms of requirements that need to be included in an enforceable blight ordinance under the general statutes. The statute that's referenced in the proposed section H, 7-148 FF, is a different topic, okay? 7148 FF, if you had that statute in front of you and you looked at subparagraph A, the first sentence of the statute, says any municipality that has regulations for the prevention and remediation of housing blight under subparagraph H15 of subdivision 7 of subsection C of section 7148, which is what I just read to you from, which is what is referenced in the first paragraph of our ordinance, okay? May, by ordinance adopted by its legislative body on recommendation of its Board of Finance or equivalent body, provide for a special assessment on housing that is blighted as defined in such regulations, okay? So the rest of 7148 FF then goes on to talk about the process by which a municipality can adopt the special assessment. And then the committee of 3 that consists of the municipality's finance director, tax assessor, and code enforcement official that is responsible for a portion of the enforcement. So I sent David an OLR memo from, I think it was 2013, that broke down the different types of blight enforcement ordinances and options that are available to Connecticut municipalities. And in that memo, it referenced, I think, only Bridgeport and Hartford as having a special assessment in place. And the reason why Bridgeport and Hartford have a special assessment in place is because they have such a large number of blighted residential properties that it consumes significant staff time. Without a special assessment, you can recoup remediation costs and you can recoup legal fees and costs, but you can't recoup overhead. The special assessment is a vehicle through which staff time can be recouped. Now, we never had a discussion at Cheshire, not at least since I've been involved, about a special assessment. So if that's a direction that you wanted to go, it is available, and it is available under 7148 FF. It would require first a recommendation by the Board of Finance. They would recommend an amount of the special assessment, and then the town council would take that up. But there's supposed to be after the Board of Finance recommends it, and before the town council would approve a special assessment, there has to be a committee that consists of not less than 6 taxpayers, one of whom shall be a landlord, the tax assessor, representatives of municipal agencies responsible for zoning, health, housing, fire, and other safety code compliance. And that committee has to, within 60 days following appointment, study and investigate the special assessment and submit a report to the Board of Finance that talks about the fiscal impact of the special assessment and identification of properties that may be subject to the special assessment, the amount of taxes generated by those properties, the costs of code compliance, including costs for police and fire personnel, and some standards for imposing the assessment. So, if that's a road that you'd like to consider going down, then we've got some other work that we would need to do in order to achieve that. Again, it's not in conflict with 7148 CH15. It's in addition to and complementary to the primary blight ordinance. It gives you a financial vehicle through which you can recoup, if you think this is necessary, you can recoup overhead, staff costs.
Okay. Well, Jeff, thank you very much, because I think that's important, because that is obviously a much more, I don't say complicated, but obviously a larger undertaking than I think we originally contemplated for this in this situation, and so Mike, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as well. I know I just wanted to see what you had on that one, but I do see that's obviously a process based on the way Jeff's explained it, where we'd have to go through this. And Jeff, quickly, who's the equivalent of the Board of Finance? Isn't it the town council?
It's the town council in Cheshire.
Okay.
There was one other thing I wanted to say. When I read H as Mike drafted it, I didn't view it as Mike was saying we should impose a special assessment. I viewed it as Mike saying there are mechanisms in 7148 FF that we can then adopt without going the special assessment route. We can basically adopt that safeguard, if you will, that 3-person committee, if that's something the town wanted to do. So in other words, if you were to go down the path of a special assessment, you have to follow the procedure in 7148 FF, right? Town council has to establish that committee. They have to study it. You have to gather all that data and see what an appropriate special assessment amount would be before you vote to do it. But if you're not looking to do a special assessment, that doesn't prevent you from borrowing that mechanism, that 3-person committee, if you will, or board, as it's referred to in 7148 FF, if you decided that, rather than just have the blight prevention officer be charged with making these decisions. We'd like to give them a buffer and create this 3-person board. So what I'm saying is, if you were to do the special assessment, you have to follow the requirements of 7-148 FF. But I didn't view that as what Mike was looking to accomplish. I viewed that reference to 7-148 FF as a reference to, hey, there's this board, and it's going to be the same board that would be established under 7-148 FF, except there's no special assessment involved. We're just taking that due process mechanism out of 7-148 FF and incorporating it into our blight ordinance.
Okay. Yeah, Mike, is that how you, because I know we talked about, we had a little conversation about the opportunity to have that kind of group to kick around items when you had your experience with that. So yeah, I think that may be helpful as well to talk about that and see if that's something that as a committee we might want to look at, because right now the current H doesn't talk about that. It talks about the ability of the blight prevention officer to enter the property and make that determination. And so without consultation, I mean, I guess practically we would assume that the blight prevention officer may have consultation with other people like the town manager or other, but there wouldn't be necessarily a formalized process, at least currently. And so what has been your experience with that?
So Jeff did a great job of summarizing my position and why I proposed this as a change. Really, it's providing structure, it's providing buffer to that primary staff member for making that call. And like I said at the last meeting, and when we had our conversation, Dave, was that when you have this instances where the town's about to enter a property because you have this property owner's a knucklehead who says, I'm just not going to fix or abate whatever the issue is. Having this board set up, meaning the director of finance, this tax assessor, et cetera, everyone knows what's going on, one. Two is no one's sticker shocked based on the cost that could do the improvements. And I gave the example of, I had an individual where we were talking about demolishing the house, and that was a significant cost that the town was going to face. And, trying to justify that price tag based on, this situation, it's just, I'd rather have that, take that, that provide that board to make, so it's multiple people saying, okay, yes, this makes sense. The price tag makes sense based on the severity of the violation, based on just overall other conditions that may be contributing to it. Also, the other side is that, let's just say that individual is in tax foreclosure. Is it really worth spending $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 to abate a blight issue if they're about to face a tax foreclosure, tax sale, et cetera? That's why, it's everyone talking together and kind of looking at all the ins and outs of what will be involved in pursuing the abatement of the violation on site. And then the other one was just that due process, built-in due process. Before the town enters, that person is going to be informed in writing 10 days prior to the town coming in that, hey, you failed to clean up the mess. We're coming, and you will be paying for that bill when we're done cleaning up whatever the mess is.
Okay. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, to have that discussion, right? I mean, because there's obviously going to be, the blight prevention officer in consultation with other members of the staff may have some, not have all the information, but hopefully gain information as well. Plus, I think it's also, there have been some concern, I think, raised in one of the public hearings and in other communication is, the concern is there's one person, one town employee who's going to be making all this, potentially these decisions. And is that what, what we want? And so with that, I guess, Peter or Don, I don't know if you have any questions on that or comments on that, and your thoughts. I guess one of the things I'm looking forward to is to see, do we, right now we have the language of H. Do we want to include something like this, at least this sort of, advisory board, or however we want to discuss it as in, as an inclusion.
I'll go.
Don, yep.
Yeah, I just have a couple comments on this.
Sure.
I know we had discussed, if the town had to go in and cut somebody's lawn, and then we'd assess them for whatever it costs to do. Now, those things are minor things that, is this something that this board would then have to take up or are we talking about major issues? And if we're talking about major issues, I'd like to find out from Jeff or Mike even, your experience in Simsbury or North Haven, have you had any issues that you would see this happening in? I know you mentioned, in Bridgeport and Hartford, this is common to do that, but is it too much for a town like ours, or do you think it's necessary in order to just make sure we're covering everything?
Well, I don't think we're talking about the special assessment. I don't think the special assessment is necessary. First of all, I think it would be a very difficult undertaking for town staff to determine what an appropriate assessment would be, because we just don't have a track record of incurring these costs, because you have no blight ordinance right now. If you adopt the blight ordinance in February and you find that, wow, it turns out that we have a lot more blight than we thought, and you want to come back in 6 months and do a 148 FF modification to adopt a special assessment, you can always do that. In terms of the added process, the only concern I would have is, I can tell you right now, we enforced the blight ordinance for North Haven and for Berlin. We wrote both those ordinances, and we really bend over backwards to give people every chance to fix their own problems. If, we've got one in Berlin right now where there's nobody living in the place, there's no mortgage, and they pay their taxes. So, we keep going out there and cutting the grass and, dealing with rodents and other issues and spending money and putting liens on the property. But it's like, a couple thousand here, a couple thousand there. We're up to like 20 grand now after a few years of doing this. And we finally have the property owner hiring a lawyer and talking to us about putting the house on the market, because it's silly. What are you going to keep paying taxes for? And our lien is second in priority only to our taxes. So we're going to get paid. Why are you going to flush money down the toilet like that when you have complete 100% equity in the property? So we do coordinate with, we do check with the tax collector to see if they're current on their taxes. Usually we'll do a title bring down to see if there's a mortgagee, because if there's a mortgagee, they have, in addition to a legal obligation, they have a business interest in not having their collateral waste. So if we find a mortgage, we'll contact the mortgagee. I just did this in another town and said, look, it's going to be cheaper for you to hire somebody to go cut the grass than it is for the town to do it and pay me legal fees to bring a lawsuit eventually to collect the money. So, I'll give you a couple of weeks to do this. And after that, it's going to prime your mortgage. So we do try to exhaust all avenues. It really is in the situation where there's no communication. I think the Latin term that Mike used was knucklehead. Yeah, it is the knucklehead that triggers this, hey, we got to do this because it's just totally unacceptable. And we're getting no cooperation or even a hint of cooperation. So, the only concern I would have with the board, I certainly agree with Mike that it takes pressure off the blight enforcement or blight prevention officer. The only concern I have is, okay, we got to get the finance director and the assessor to agree to serve on the board. Are they going to want to do it? Are they going to want to be involved in it? And the answer may be, well, we don't expect a lot of volume, but none of us have a crystal ball. Who knows? what's going to come along, down the road.
But that's what I was wondering, like those three people, I mean, or should it be the assistant town manager or somebody else, I don't know.
Welcome, Arnett.
I don't want to throw more work onto, but I really don't know how often this will be actually used in terms of, the amount of blight. And I guess it's kind of hard for us to know until we get into it. So.
Right. And this is only being used, this is a subsection, right? This isn't every time there's a problem or there's a blight issue. This is only where the problem, the imposing of fines isn't working, and the problem has gotten to such a level that the town finally has to go in and actually remedy it itself, rather than just continuing to hope that the owner's going to do it. So, right, it's only going to be a fraction of the numbers. So even of the blighted properties, this is only going to be a small fraction of the numbers of times we're going to have to do that. So, right, I don't know how often, this committee's ever, thankfully, I would hope that they're probably not going to have to do too many of these. But that's still an issue. So, that's something that we'll that's I want to keep kicking around to see, because I think really, from what I'm hearing from both Jeff and Mike, I think, that we're not necessarily needing the whole paragraph that's here, but potentially, there's nuggets from it. Do we want to extract those and incorporate those into what we have currently right now as paragraph H in the original draft that we have? So.
Yeah, the big decision really is how you feel about a board, because if you have the board, then, the blight prevention officer goes to the board and says, I want to go on the property to remedy the blight because I issued the NOV, I got no response. Or I issued the NOV and I got a citation issued by the hearing officer and I want to go on the property and remediate it. So the big question is, do you want to have that board there to basically provide that second layer of protection? There were, I have my notes from the public hearing and the October 12th, public hearing. There were 13 residents that spoke, and the residents that were concerned and spoke not necessarily in opposition to the blight ordinance, but expressed concerns about it, expressed concerns about discretion, right? They said that they were very concerned about, situations where a property ended up in foreclosure or where the town was a little bit too aggressive with enforcing the ordinance. So, if I'll tell you, my feeling on it is just that if somebody feels that they're being targeted, if somebody feels the town is being aggressive with the ordinance, having a committee made up of town employees is not going to make that feeling go away. It's like I think, David, I used the analogy the other day in federal government construction projects. If you contract with the GSA and they don't pay you, you have to go through a 3-step process. The first step is a dispute resolution board made up of employees of the agency. The second step is lawyers that comprise the Board of Contract Appeals. And then finally, you get to go to court. So, people, I have full expectation that the team that we have is going to be very judicious and very equitable and very fair, and that we only use this when we have to, because it's a public health and safety and public welfare issue. But, the idea of adding the board is to give the public a comfort that, it's not just the blight prevention officer that's going out and doing this. There's a separate board. But I'm just saying, my experience is that you're probably never going to make that person happy. You could even the reason that Mike and I didn't even talk about this directly, but I'm sure the reason why he had this composition is because it came right from the statute. So you could say, this isn't some arbitrary board composition. This came right out of 7148 FF. 7148 FF says in deciding to impose this assessment, you have this board, right? So we're using those same folks, but my only point, in kind of a long-winded way, I guess, is if somebody is suspicious that they're not being treated fairly, having a board made up of 3 other town employees isn't going to satisfy them.
Right. That makes total sense. And Jeff, I would, from your perspective, in for example, in North Haven and Berlin, do they have this I mean, I assume not. I assume that there's no committee in those towns, right? If they have to take this action.
Well, North Haven has
They have a board. They have an appointed board.
Yeah, it's a blight appeals board. I mean, it's instead of a blight hearing officer, but that's something they wanted. They didn't want to have one person as a hearing officer. Okay. They wanted to have a board. So they have a board. And that board is working fine. But, when I started this, you guys had told me, hey, we read North Haven's ordinance. We don't want a board.
Right. No, and I get that. But is that board here the same? Obviously, they hear the appeals of, the normal ordinance issues. Do they also hear an appeal of something if it was related to this type of, a decision made to go on to a property and remedy the situation? Do they also?
No, they just act as an appeals board. They act the same way that the hearing officer is set up to act under this ordinance. Yep. Instead of it being one person, it's a group.
Okay.
So there's no there's no the assessor, the finance director, and the code enforcement officer are not a board in the blight capacity.
Right. So it's still the blight prevention officer or whatever their official title is in North Haven who would make that decision, probably, and I assume in consultation potentially with some of those same people, the assessor and the tax collector, probably the town manager, maybe the fire marshal, talking to other town staff as well to make that decision. But I'm assuming that they would, they're not just going to do it sort of, at least I would expect they probably wouldn't do it sort of sua sponte. They would they're going to talk to other people before they do that. And we could probably have some kind of policy on that, between, as we move forward with that. But as far as not necessarily having to spell it out that there is a official committee in the ordinance itself.
Yeah, the typical sequence of events, depending upon the nature of the complaint, after the blight enforcement officer does a preliminary investigation, again, depending upon the nature of the alleged violation, the blight enforcement officer talks to the building official, the zoning enforcement officer, the fire marshal, and potentially QVHD, the health department.
Okay.
And that's it's always, I think Mike used a great word in his memo, holistic. It's always a holistic approach on enforcement, because again, the last thing we want to do with any resident, it's like tax foreclosures, right? We don't want to take anybody's house. And the last thing we want to do is go onto your property and touch anything. Okay, that's not the best use of our public works department. We understand it's private property. We understand that you don't want us on there, but the whole idea behind the ordinance is just to give the town a tool for those occasional properties that, for whatever, and sometimes the people just can't afford to remediate the problem. Sometimes they're very cooperative and they're, we don't want to ever embarrass anybody. That's not at all the goal of this. This is not a weapon. Okay. This is a tool that will be used sparingly. Okay. It's not, we really haven't had in North Haven since we drafted that ordinance, and in Berlin since we've been corporation counsel since 2016. we really haven't had anyone complain that, I'm being targeted or this is unfair. We have, occasionally we have disagreements about how much time we should give someone to comply and how many opportunities they should be given if they break promises to the town, because neighbors, usually are the source of the complaint, and they have an expectation that we're going to do our job and we're going to enforce the ordinance. And sometimes, folks need time. They don't have the cash available, or in this climate, they can't find a contractor. And so we're always balancing the interest of the complainant with the interest of the property owner, all of us understanding that the goal is compliance. The goal is not to lien someone's property or to penalize them in any way. This is not a punitive endeavor. Okay, this is a tool that we would like to have available for those few occasions every once in a while where we have a blight and nothing's being done about it.
Excellent. Peter, anything?
Yeah, so I agree that we don't need the special assessment. Jeff said it differently, but I never envisioned that the blight officer was going to do this in a vacuum. I'm hoping that he's going to be speaking to human resources, to public works, to the assessor, to finance, to Sean, to Arnett, so on and so on. So for the purpose of this exercise tonight, I say let's revert back to the old H, and we can always revisit if we get to a situation where nothing's happening and we need to put a little more bite into the bark, so to speak.
Or if this becomes an issue and we feel that, for whatever reason, people do have this problem, and maybe we do want to have a committee to insulate the blight prevention officer at some point in time, but as I said, I don't foresee this is going to be a process being used on a regular basis enough that it's going to create that kind of, or it's going to generate that kind of need. So I don't have a problem with it. Don, what do you think about that? Is what are you good with the proposed H, what's in the I'll call the December draft?
Yeah, no, I agree with Peter. That's the road I was going down. I just felt that, we can add 100 more pages to this if we really wanted to, but I think less is more sometimes, and I think we're okay with what we have. And like Jeff said, if we need to revisit it down the road, we can always do that. But once we have stuff in there, it's harder to take out, then it's easier to put stuff back, put in. So I agree with Peter. And I think we should just revert to the old one.
Okay, great. And Jeff, one last question of you. The H that you have in here, the December draft, is that the language that you would have like in North Haven or Berlin?
Yes, the way the December draft reads in paragraph H is when a notice violation isn't corrected by the date specified in the NOV, the blight enforcement officer can go onto the property. Again, understanding nobody can go inside anybody's house, right? We're talking about outside. Normal business hours for remediating at the cost of the property owner, and the cost and expense is a lien on the property that can be foreclosed. That's the way it works. Whenever we have an issue that requires going inside, we go to court. We don't push the envelope there because the statute's very clear that we can't go in the house without a court order.
And under this provision, if the blight prevention officer wants to make that entry, that is, do they give notice to the owner before they make entry? Do they?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Because I just want to make sure that the way that the January H was set up, obviously under that statute, had very clear timelines, but practically those timelines are built into how you enforce this provision as well. Correct?
Absolutely. again, it's a last resort. You know, we really, you know, everybody on the town side, from, you know, town council to town staff to town attorney, none of us want to have to use that. Ideally, a violation is noticed and we either receive compliance voluntarily or we work out a plan. You know, call us up. Some of it, they may have a plan and they're just waiting. You know, they may have the problem finding a contractor. They may be lining up the financing. They may have the work scheduled. So let's come up with a plan. Let's get the work done. We'll work with you to the maximum extent possible. And, you know, if people think it's not, you know, if they receive an NOV and they feel it's not a violation, they should appeal.
Okay.
You know, we'll tell them how to do that.
Perfect. Well, Jeff, and thank you very much. And Mike as well on this one. I think, you know, this was a good exercise, I think, to really understand what, you know, what other some options are and how we might have some other issues. But I think with this, I think there's consensus here. I think all of us agree that it would be good to, I think, I think we're at this point want to stick with the December H that's in the existing draft, and we'll address that as we, you know, if need be in the future. But so we're going to stick with the H that's in the current December draft, which is great. Thank you all. And then we're going to go to the last section that I think we need to talk about are the definitional sections of N, O, P, and Q of the ordinance. And so right now, I think, you know, we've had to add a substitute an O, which would be illegal activities are conducted in the premises as documented in the police department records. P would be it's a fire hazard as determined by the fire marshal as documented in fire department in the fire department. And then Q was I think basically a sort of a consolidation of the language that appeared in the December draft of sections O and P and Q, all sort of being merged together into one. And so what I wanted, so I guess we'll start with O and illegal activities. Now I know in the draft you'll see that Jeff and Lou D'Agostino from his office have made comments, you know, on that as far as wanting to include illegal activities in that section. And I want to have an opportunity to see if that's something that we still want to include. I know, Jeff, you had some concerns about what was considered illegal, what all types of activities, and is there a way to incorporate some of that into either one of the other sections here without it necessarily being quite so, as its own standalone provision?
I think it just comes down to a question of approach, you know. I think if you certainly there are various types of illegal activities that pose a serious threat to the safety, health, and general welfare of the community. So they would fall under N, right? So
Right.
if you want to specify, you know, illegal activities as determined by the police department, I don't have any problem with that. The only concern that I would have about it is, are we going to cause people to go to the police department with their blight complaints? So if we went in that direction, if we said illegal activities as determined by the Cheshire Police Department, then I would add some kind of a provision that says, you know, notwithstanding anything herein to the contrary, any blight complaints should be directed to the blight prevention officer. Just to make very clear to people that just because we're mentioning the police department doesn't mean that you should go make your blight complaints to them.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that, I mean, illegal activity falls under blight as anyway. I mean, does it really? I mean, unless, I mean, I think that's a whole different subject. You know, I mean, illegal. I mean, say for instance, is domestic abuse, which is illegal activity, and I mean, and you know, the you know, whether the spouse, one of the spouses, has to live in the home, and are we going to go and say, well, that, you know, the neighbors are complaining because there was illegal activity there. Are we going to call that blight? I think we're opening a can of worms here without specifically saying what kind of illegal activity we're talking about. I like the one paragraph that you put in that I think Guilford has, which kind of covers it all. And I think that's more to what I would prefer than to get into this illegal activity. I don't really feel that falls under the blight. That's more of a police issue.
And Don, I agree. I think that was one of the things I was going to bring up. The paragraph under P, which was the Guilford language that you're talking about, sort of mirrors what is our current N. And so the question is, if we, and perhaps both proposed O and P could incorporate, I know I was going to say in P, perhaps we could incorporate including the fire marshal into N, which would, I think, address the proposed paragraph P, because right now, I mean, that's really what we're doing. We want to incorporate the fire marshal as a person who could determine that a building, structure, parcel of land is in a condition that creates a serious threat to safety, health, and general welfare. Because obviously, that's, of course, if the building is, if the building according to the fire marshal has either structural problems, it's been burned, it's whatever, may create. I mean, that's somebody who's going to make a determination that it's going to be not safe or it's in. So that was I think that's one of the questions I would have too, is if we included, and maybe in skipping to P, I think P could be addressed by that, adding the fire marshal there. I guess my question is, do we think that O could be addressed by that as well, just by citing? I mean, I'm not sure who we would cite, but I guess we talk about this term. If we talk about the police structure, I mean, I don't know who we would, but whether that's we could incorporate the police or somehow, or police reports. I mean, and I think one of the things that, Jeff, you had talked about in your thing is it's not necessarily activities. I think, Mike, you would agree too. I think a lot of it is that it becomes an accumulation of police reports, people concerned about activities that are occurring on the property. Correct? I think that's what you were concerned about in that activity, including things like nuisances and trespass and other things of that nature.
Because that could fall into fireworks, somebody shooting off fireworks. I mean, I don't know. I think it's just opening a whole can of worms with that. I mean, unless somebody's putting a sign out saying, "Hey, we have all kinds of drugs here. Come and stop by." I mean, there's nothing. I think it's more of a police matter than falling under the Blight Ordinance.
Well, what about, because again, the whole idea of the Blight Ordinance is to address conditions of buildings, structures, and parcels of land, right? So what if you just in N, what if you added, right now it says determined by the Blight Prevention Officer, Building Official, Director of Health. You want to add Fire Marshal or Police Department?
Right. Well, I think if we had wanted to address P, the proposed section P, I think simply adding fire marshal to that list addresses P as an issue. The question then is, how do if we want to deal with illegal activities on the property, which, as I said, probably maybe, as I said, things like as Mike would put on, trespassing or attractive nuisance type things. What if you have an abandoned house that people, and Mike, you can obviously address this yourself. I don't need to speak for you, but I know you talked about issues of attractive nuisance and
right. So it might, in my experience, that subsection would come into play when it's the abandoned home that becomes the neighborhood party spot where the kids are getting in at night and it's not a safe situation. They're partying, they're doing, the example being was, in my experience in Simsbury, was a vacant tobacco barn that they built a fire pit inside the tobacco barn. And that was the, let's go for a Saturday night drinking party. Yikes. And in addition to that, this structure was unsafe. We had reports of the police department was out several times because there were large, parties, et cetera, and it wasn't secure. That's the other thing. I mean, this was a structure that was left open. So it became an attractive nuisance as all these reports piled up. That gave the blight prevention officer, in addition to the structure was, in a state of disrepair, it was open. We had these nuisance things occurring. And I understand that, when you see the police are thinking other things, it's these instances because what will happen, it's the vacant structure that becomes a magnet for some sort of activity that's outside of the norm of the neighborhood. And it's just an added tool to say, here it meets the following boxes on the checklist of why is it considered blight? So then, it's clear, why did this individual get cited?
But wouldn't those things fall under other categories anyway? Because you're saying if there's structural issues, the police go in there and they break up the party and they notice that there's structural issues. Then they report to the blight officer saying there's structural issues with this building. And, does that fall under another section of this blight ordinance, or is it something that we have to add in there saying illegal activity going on?
Well, if they walked into a structure, let's say they noticed something like it looked unsafe, like collapse, the first thing they're probably going to do, the police is going to call the building official to determine whether he's going to determine that it's structurally, if it's sound. The next on this list would be, does it fall under any of the categories of blight? Because it's a team approach. So you'd have potentially a violation of the Connecticut State Building Code. You'd have potentially a violation of the local blight ordinance. And like I said earlier, this is most likely, it's not something that's going to occur on a daily basis. These are one in 100 properties that are just in a total state of disrepair for whatever reason, and may or may not, my experience, 9 out of 10 of them were either estates where there wasn't children who lived in the area or relatives that lived in the area, and the individual who owned the property is deceased and it sat in probate, or there was no estate to claim, or it was bank-owned homes. If the market, like the real estate market's hot right now, but if it corrects itself and we go back to what occurred back in 2008 and into 2011, 2012, we saw a lot of these foreclosures, and these are those, especially if it's someone who had a second mortgage on a house, and like I said, the estate situation, that's where you get these sort of properties that become the attractive nuisance. But like I said, I mean, it's a multiple code official approach when we deal with these issues.
But in something,
I'm sorry, Don.
In a case like that, if we didn't have the paragraph said illegal activity, we would still be able to issue a blight ordinance against this, because if they're falling under numerous other categories. I just have an issue putting illegal activity out there, because I think it's almost kind of like the ripped screen issue. And next thing you know, everybody's going to say, "Oh, great! My neighbor got arrested. I'm gonna call the blight officer." And I just get concerned about something like that.
And I think if you list in the current N, if you list fire marshal and police department, I think it covers O and P and addresses all the issues that Mike brought up in those paragraphs.
I agree.
Because then it's general welfare, as Jeff said, it's general welfare of the community, and then you've got the right. And Don, I agree totally with what you said about the kind of illegal activity is covered in different areas of law and ordinances and statutes and everything else. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think that you add fire marshal and police department to N. You don't have to use the phrase illegal activities.
Yep.
And you illegal activities are a threat to safety.
Right.
Okay. Under any provision of the Connecticut Penal Code, any crime is a threat to public safety and general welfare of the community. So it's going to get covered under N. But by adding the police department, you're giving the clear indication that the police department can make a determination that there's a threat to safety, and that's going to be considered if it involves building, structure, or parcel of land and the condition thereof, it's going to be enforced as such.
And I think one of the other things that came up is, and I think, Mike, I think one of the things you and I discussed too was, and I think we can still incorporate this, but I think one of the things that Mike raised with me was that in light of all of these things, right, each violation of the Blight Ordinance is its own separate violation. And as a result, if there's one violation, then there's one violation. But if they've had multiple violations of various provisions of this thing, now potentially we could be looking at $100 a day per violation. And if there's 3 or 4 violations, then obviously it becomes I think so I think that factored into, I think, some of the issues is, if do you want to make that activity its own separate violation to add on to it? But I think in the end, if the ultimate goal is simply compliance with this, then I'm not sure that necessarily we need to hit them with a $500 a day fine. If $100 or $200, I mean, if they're at 100, I'm not sure $100 or $200 a day is going to make them any less motivated than $500 a day. Because if they're going to pay it, they're going to pay it. If they're not going to pay it, they're not going to pay it. And so I don't know that we want to add that as its own separate encumbrance, but it definitely is a tool in the box to factor into when is this, and who gets, who has, the ability to sort of oversee that. So I think we're all on the same page. So Jeff, on current draft, on December draft N, we would add to the list of officers. So instead of blight prevention officer, building official, fire marshal, I guess what we call just the police department in general.
Yeah, Cheshire Police,
Cheshire Police, or director of health. And so we add those 2 offices to N. I think that addresses the issues that Mike very properly raised under his drafts for O and P. And as such, I think we can then revert back to O and P of the original December draft. And then as a result of leaving O and P, we would then leave original Q as well and not incorporate the compilation Q that Mike had put together. So I think at that point we would have N as modified to include the fire marshal and police department, and then leave December O, December P, and December Q as our ordinance under those definitions.
Sold.
Does that sound good? Mike, you all set with, is that good too? All right.
I'm good.
Don, Peter, and is that all?
That's good.
We're good with that?
Good for me.
Excellent. So with that,
do you want a motion then?
yeah, I think at this point, I think we're good with what we have. But before we do that, are there any other items to address? Just like, no, do not.
Beat this to hell. Come on.
You know how you go to the
I'm with
movies
Jeff.
and you know how you go to the movies and you hear the Coca-Cola and you get thirsty? That's what I'm doing. Subliminal messages.
Yeah. All right. So with that, I will ask for a motion to adopt the revisions as discussed to sections. What is this? Section 3, N, O, P, and well, actually, no, we don't need to address those. We only need to address the changes to section 3N, and then our changes to section H,
So
7H, and changes to section 9, or which that was pretty straightforward. So
I got it.
with all those changes, do I hear a motion to, I guess, accept the draft and recommend referral to the council for adoption?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Excellent. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Mike, I appreciate very much all your jumping in on your first week to
Yeah, great
really-
job, Mike. Thank you.
really give
Thanks,
us
guys.
some good ideas to think about and incorporate. I think that really helped make this a better draft. And then Jeff, I appreciate all your time on this as well. Not only up to this point, but obviously also trying to facilitate that. One last question I have for you is, and I know we have technically already called for a public hearing on February 8th on this. I guess, although we may still do that, I guess my question to you is, based on the changes that we've made, do you feel that we need to have a public hearing? We may want to have a public hearing, and that's fine. I guess my question is, do you think it's necessary that we have a public hearing on these changes that we have raised?
I do not. I do not think the changes are material. If we had added H, then I would have felt otherwise, but I don't think that the changes we made are material. I think the changes are very consistent with the draft that was presented at public hearing in October. If anything, all we've done is elaborate on the enforcement process and provide more detail on how it's going to work, but it's totally consistent with what was presented at the public hearing. Like you said, it's discretionary. If you feel like you'd like to have another public hearing, you certainly have a right to do that, but it's not mandatory, and I don't think it's necessary.
Okay, I appreciate that. I just wanted to bounce that off you while we had you here on this, and I know that our discussion a couple weeks ago, we had that discussion of, your thought was we may or we may not need a public hearing depending on what this committee did and what the committee ultimately recommended to the council. So I appreciate your feedback on that. I appreciate everyone's time here. And with that, absent any other matters, I will call for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved.
Moved by Peter, seconded by Don. All those in favor? Thank you very much. Have a great evening.